All right, welcome everyone to a new episode of the Roscoe's Wetsuit Podcast. I have a very special guest on the show with me today. We have Professor Santiago Jaramillo. Professor Jaramillo is an assistant professor at the Department of Biology at the University of Oregon. His research interests include studying neural circuits that mediate behavioral flexibility and attention, auditory coding, neural computation, and his lab is specifically interested in studying the neural circuits that mediate auditory cognition, which is what we're going to talk about today. So welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
Absolutely. So tell me, I guess, what kind of projects is your guys' lab working on right now?
Yes, so let's start a little big picture. So the idea is to try to understand how we hear the world. And this means how is it that our ears perceive these sounds and our brain interprets those sounds to produce behavior. So we want to study different processes like how can we pay attention to a voice in a crowd and ignore all the noises around, or how we're able to remember the song that we heard from yesterday, or how we're able to predict if a sound is repetitive, what's going to happen next. And so all these processes is what we consider auditory cognition. And we want to understand it from the perspective of how the neurons in the brain are communicating to each other to make these processes happen. So a few of the projects that are going on in the lab, for those projects, we use mice so that we can actually have experimental accessibility. So we can actually get to measure and change the activity of individual neurons and see how they're communicating with each other in different parts of the brain, all the way from the ear through the different stages in the brain until eventually you get to regions like the auditory cortex, which are central for auditory processing, and what happens from then until the place where neurons are going to be controlling our behavior, either because we want to speak something or we want to move or we want to stop.
And is auditory processing, is it pretty universal as far as how it works, from individual to individual, or is there a lot of variability as far as how our brains process auditory information?
Yeah, so there are some commonalities. So if we think first about how our brains are organized, then most humans have the same organization in the brain. So if we think about the brain areas, you also have two ears. Those ears are connected to a region in the brain that is very similar between your brain and my brain, and that can be verified with fMRI scans or fMRI scans. And let's see. So if we think about how similar these processes are, and at what point they start being different, then we see that we are born with about the same hardware, except for a few differences in our genetics. And then depending on our experience, then we can develop a better ability to process or discriminate some sounds than others. One specific example of that we are actually starting to collaborate with a linguist, a colleague of ours at the university, is learning a second language. So we want to understand how you learn to differentiate sounds that in your language are about the same, but in the other language, it's very important that you can tell them apart. So as a native Spanish speaker, the difference between the word sheep and ship was challenging to learn at the beginning, because in Spanish, those two phonemes, those two sounds are pretty much combined into the same one. But in English, it's very different. And of course, the two words have different meanings. So that's kind of going about how individual is this process of kind of auditory cognition and auditory processing depends both on our genetics and our experience in the world.
And is there truth to kind of the popular notion that, it's like easier to learn a language, as a younger child? And if so, do we kind of know why, as far as like, is there more kind of neuroplasticity going on within the auditory cortex at a younger age, or what can you tell me about that?
Yeah, so there's definitely evidence that shows how the brain plasticity changes throughout development, so as we grow older, and that is a lot more plastic early in life. So this kind of argues for the idea that it's almost experienced anecdotally, in our everyday lives, that children can learn things very quickly and are very adaptable. And as we grow older, then we become more kind of fixed in our ways. So there's definitely evidence for that. And although we don't study that part directly, we study mostly adults, then it's an interesting question in neuroscience to understand how the systems are developing to provide this flexibility and be able to learn very well as you develop, as you grow up, and yet kind of converge to the place where you can be very effective at solving problems, and or always be so flexible that you never, let's say, remember what happened before because you're changing all the time, or that you never become good at doing anything because you're always changing your ways.
Right, right. So as far as with kind of the sort of environmental factors, do we know what sort of specifically contributes to, say, someone, is it specific like techniques or tools, say, to like increase, auditory cognition, learning a new language, for example? What do we know as far as about the environmental factors?
Yeah, I can tell you a little more about what questions we have about it. So I don't think there are yet many solutions that you could imagine a future where we have an implant that interfaces with our brains that allows you to maybe recall this new language that just by adding the implant, then you suddenly have the new language, or you can download new information into your brain, or processes that are more about directly interfacing with the brain. Or maybe what we get to discover is better strategies of learning. And this is one of the outcomes that we hope to get from our projects, is as we study, let's say, how a human learns to differentiate these sounds, and we go into the mouse and we understand what is changing in the brain that makes this learning possible, then maybe we can come up with ideas of, if these are the changes that are happening in the brain, maybe we should have a different schedule, a different set of steps on how we learn things. So maybe we shouldn't just, like cramming for an exam. Maybe we need particular time of spacing, letting the system resettle into some other state because it will be more receptive to new information. Or maybe a combination between how much exposure to new sounds you get versus how much you're actually engaging, let's say, doing a test or performing for feedback. Maybe there is a balance between those two factors. So it is these strategies that in the near future, we may be able to say, by understanding how learning happens in the brain, then we can predict, we can provide strategies for better learning in human behavior.
Right.
And then we'll have to wait a little longer to actually get to the point where we get enough understanding and enough of the technological developments to really have the interfaces where we just say, oh, I just want a new language, click the button, download, done.
Right. Might have to ask Elon Musk for that.
Yeah, so there's actually many efforts in terms of brain-computer interfaces, brain-machine interfaces, and it is kind of one of my dreams, basically, one of my motivations in neuroscience. For neuroscience is this idea that the more we understand about how the brain works, the more we will be able to connect brains and improve communication. So if you take it to the extreme, is the science fiction concept of a mind meld. But if we just take it to this idea that communication between humans is sometimes ambiguous, and then maybe the other person doesn't get the meaning that I want, and I have no acknowledgement that actually that's what happened, and then I just have an assumption of what I thought the person got. So all these inconvenience that happen in communication, maybe the process may be improved if we understand better how we represent one idea that we want to transfer. And in this case, sometimes it's easier to explain it with the concept of transmitting just a mental image that I have, or a song in my head, if you will. So I could close my eyes and go with my mind's eye around this let's say I want to describe how my front porch looks like, and I want to describe it to you. And as I do it, I go with my mind's eye kind of through the different details that I want to say, and I have to translate them into words that may convey a meaning to me that is a little different to the one that it conveys to you. But what if I could transfer that mental image that I have, or that song that I'm singing in my head, but maybe I'm not very good at singing with my voice, if I could just transfer that directly into your brain? And the way to do it, it seems like we now have enough understanding about the brain that it shouldn't be an impossibility. We know that everything we perceive and everything we think about is represented in the brain. So we have identified regions in the brain and specific neurons that respond to the things, not only the things we're hearing, but let's say when we imagine sounds, then they also get active. So we could read out that information, then we could transfer it through any channel, hopefully a secure channel, so that people are not just spying on other people's thoughts. And that information can get to your brain. And if we know which ones are the neurons that you have in your brain, that when activated in particular ways, will produce that sensation to you, then now we have a system of, technology assisted telepathy, if you will.
And how far away, as far as how many years do you think realistically we are kind of away from something like that actually being realistic?
So that's a good question, but it has to be refined to get an actual answer. So you could imagine that if what I want is a device that whenever I think, let's say, whenever I close my hand, I make your hand close, then that already exists. They sell a little device that you plug to your muscle, and then you plug the other device to my muscle, and then you plug it to your muscle, and then whenever I close my arm, then you close your arm. So that's already like an interface that exists. Now, let's say that now what we want is something that where I think about moving, then you move, or you think of moving. Then there's already people who have gone through the process of getting implants, because that was kind of a last resort for people who were paralyzed. And they can move cursors on the screen, they can move robotic arms. So that we already have that type of interface. Now, if we push it to the point of how about communicating from brain to brain without using spoken or written language, then I think one of the main challenges is what are the technological developments that have to happen so that it's safe to record activity and influence the activity in a human brain, let's say for a long enough term without damage. So one possibility is to do it non-invasively with techniques like electroencephalography or magnetoencephalography. The problem is that the precision, you're not measuring individual neurons, and maybe that's not sufficient to really get the resolution that you need to transfer a thought the way that we gave these examples, right? So there's those kind of challenges in the technology, but there's also challenges in understanding how the neurons represent the information we want to transmit. So kind of balancing, I want to make a parenthesis here of like, I said that I have a dream of improving communication by understanding these processes in the brain and implementing telepathy machines, if you will. But before we can get to that point, we need to understand how this information is represented in the brain. And that's what my research group is actually focusing on. So we're not yet developing the devices, we're understanding how information about what we hear is represented in the brain, so that eventually we can help this broader question of how we can improve communication.
I see.
So I know I didn't answer your question of a time, of a number of years, but again, it depends on how you slice it.
Sure. How about as far as, have there been any like really surprising findings that you guys, like anything that you were pretty sure that you thought, auditory cognition worked a certain way, but then there, it was a finding out of your guys' lab that showed that it actually worked a different way? Have there been any really?
Yeah, so in research, there's always little things like that. Sometimes they're small, and sometimes they're like, maybe only the people in my field will kind of pay attention to this little quirk of nature. And sometimes there are things that are more surprising and relevant to a broader audience. So one thing that I can tell you as an example is the different areas in the brain are given different names, sometimes depending on what they're connected to, sometimes depending on the location, anatomical, physical location, sometimes depending on who studied it for a long time. So think of Broca's area or Wernicke's area. And sometimes these names, especially the ones that are associated with functional properties, like the auditory cortex, may be a little misleading to some people because they almost imply that you need the auditory cortex to hear. So getting back to your question of one of the kind of results that was a little surprising is that we did some studies where we tested if the auditory cortex, and in particular the primary auditory cortex, that is the first part in the cerebral cortex that is reached by the signals that come from the ears, if that part of the brain was necessary for a behavior in which the animals had to learn a sound. One sound means go to the right to get reward. Another sound means go to the left to get reward. And then at some point, the association between sounds and places would change, and they have to adapt. They have to learn that now this sound that before meant go to the left, now it means go to the right. And we thought, okay, maybe the auditory cortex is necessary for hearing. So if you remove it, you won't be able to do the task. But surprisingly, even like with different techniques, we either inhibit the activity or surgically you can remove parts of the cortex and the animal will still behave normally. And when we asked the animals to perform the task, they were performing as if nothing had happened. So this would kind of indicate that even if a region has an associated name like auditory cortex, it doesn't mean that it's necessary for all auditory behaviors. And a couple of other examples related to this idea are that the startle response, let's say if I clap really hard and you jump, that process doesn't require the more complex parts of the brain, the cortex. That can happen just as a reflexive response from the brainstem. And then another process like fear conditioning to sounds. Imagine that every time you hear this sound, then something bad happens. And then you start associating that. That association doesn't need the auditory cortex either. But there are other places, in this particular case, the thalamus, which is in the middle of the brain, will be necessary to create this association between the sound and the aversive stimulus. So it's important to keep in mind, as I answer the question of surprising things, that some of those surprises come from prejudices that people have, given that, let's say, an area had a name attached to it, or someone found one interesting result, and then people started over-interpreting that, either people in a scientific field or the broader audience, because there was a newspaper article about it, and it became kind of like common knowledge, but no one really challenged what it meant or how specific the result was. So we're hoping that as scientists, we can convey to the general public that some of these results may be very specific about the thing that we study. And we hope that they provide kind of ideas for the broader context, but those will have to be tested. And it's only via this scientific method of having observations and developing hypotheses and testing with evidence that we can verify that that is the case.
And to make sure that I'm understanding correctly, so if, say, the mice that you talked about where they, can have their auditory cortices like surgically removed, is this a case where kind of other regions of the brain are kind of taking over the functions of the auditory cortex when it is removed? Is that sort of what's happening?
Yeah, so in some cases it is, and that is still an open question. So you could imagine that in the particular case that we're talking about, there are multiple pathways that could take signals that come from the ears and connect those signals to the place where you can drive muscles, so you can make a human or an animal move. So there are parallel pathways, and the information could take different routes. So even if you block one of those routes, then there's still the other ones. So you could call that taking over, right? Like another place is taking over. But really, in this case, it was always there. It was always functioning, that parallel pathway. There are other cases. There have been some fascinating studies where uh, if you change one sensory system, then the circuits that you use for another sensory system start compensating. And and it's reflected in these ideas that a person who loses one sense, then it gets sharper in the other. But also sometimes, if the right connections are there, then you may recover some of the abilities that you lost, just because the system is really reorganizing to try to account for that.
Okay, that makes sense. How about as far as with future research? What sort of ideas, as far as different projects that you would like to work on, or that you're paying attention, that other laboratories are working on, that really interest you?
Yeah, so there's two main directions that we're really interested in. One is the one that I mentioned, related to understanding how the system changes as we learn, to really provide better strategies for how we learn, especially in the context of sounds. And the other direction that we're really excited about is thinking of the brain as a prediction machine. So this is an idea that has been kind of around for a long time. And only recently, people have had the tools to study this idea at the kind of the cellular level, the interaction between the neurons and how the activity really relates to these predictions. So let me give you an idea of what I'm talking about. We, on our everyday, we're able to make predictions about what's going to happen. And that ability to predict what's going to happen is very advantageous to our behavior. It makes us faster at responding. It makes us better at responding appropriately in certain situations. And it seems like it's just a general advantage of any system to be able to have an internal model of the world so that it can make a prediction of what's going to happen. Either what's going to happen if I move my arm, am I going to get what I want? Or if I hear this sound, what is the sound? How is the sound going to continue? And that's the process we would like to understand. How is it that the auditory system, that part of the brain, or those parts of the brain that are involved in processing sounds, how are they making predictions about sounds? Which parts are the ones that are making predictions? Which parts are the ones that are comparing what you hear with what you predicted and calculating some error, so that then you can adapt your internal model and make better predictions in the future? So you can think of it two ways. One is, how are the predictions and the errors represented? And the other one is, how are those used to improve the way you make predictions in the future?
Right. Are our brains pretty accurate as far as with being able to predict things, or are we kind of susceptible to false predictions?
Yeah, there's always false predictions, and you can think of it as illusions. So visual illusions or perceptual illusions in general are almost like these false predictions. When we make predictions, much of the kind of the hardware that we have for making predictions comes, as we said earlier in the chat today, comes from our genetics and the brain structure that we have. But a lot of it also comes from the environment in which we develop and the things that we've experienced so far. So you could imagine that a system that evolved, let's say humans, we evolved in this particular world where the sun is mostly above and things look of a particular shapes and colors, then that makes our brain make predictions according to those statistics of the world. If we go to a very alien world and things are very different, then our predictions will be off. So an illusion, an optical illusion, is that. It's kind of being in this alien world where the statistics don't quite match what we're experiencing normally. So they throw off our perception, and they make us believe something that is not there. And that's just if we think about like an optical illusion as a piece of paper, but it's the same when we make predictions about time. If we've been exposed to a particular set of statistics, then our brain creates this model, this internal model of what's going to happen, and it makes a prediction. But you could imagine that that process can be thrown off by different factors depending on what we're experiencing. So to your question of like, is the brain very good at making predictions? In some cases it is. You could imagine that like the professional sports players who can do things so fast, or like musical performers that can do things like so refined, it's because the brain has trained itself to make these predictions and kind of integrate all this information across time so that everything is perfectly timed in the future. But in many other cases, we make pretty bad predictions.
Right, right. So it's something that we can work on, basically practice to improve. Or is it just that some people might have the capability to improve that?
I don't know.
Chicken or the egg sort of situation, maybe.
I don't know if I can answer that one. Like are geniuses born or made is a question that I'm not gonna get into, but I'm going to encourage anyone who's interested in becoming better to give it a try. So you shouldn't just believe that, oh no, I wasn't born with it. You try it out and you find the strategies that work for you to improve, and then you see how far you get. And if you're like me and what matters to you is to enjoy life, then you will be satisfied with those, let's say, 3 songs that you learn in the ukulele, or with how well you can, play volleyball in the intermediate level of your league, instead of having to be everyone just the top best of the world.
Is there, this also might be a difficult question to answer, but is there a limit to I guess the amount of information that the brain is able to process auditorily? Like, for instance, like, could someone just continue learning more and more languages, or are they going to eventually reach a point?
I'm going to take that question, and instead of looking at it from the perspective of learning, let's look at it from the perspective of attention. Meaning, are we able, if we are in a crowd, or let's say the example usually given in the field is a cocktail party. Have you heard about the cocktail party problem? This idea that you are in a party, there's many strings of sounds, and you want to be able to focus on one and ignore the other ones. So we could ask the question, are brains able to process multiple streams at once? And it's clear from psychology experiments that there is a limitation on how much we can do. And that if we try to do multiple things at once, let's say try to pay attention to multiple sounds at once, we will be decreasing our accuracy on how we perceive each one of them. So there's definitely limitations just by the fact that the brain is also a physical thing. It cannot represent infinite information. But there are a few tricks and strategies that we use to kind of almost fake it sometimes. One example that you could imagine is in that cocktail party, you could be multiplexing. You very quickly switch your attention from one source to the other, and then you're almost able to have 2 conversations. Maybe if you try to do the third one, then everything breaks down. So yes, there's definitely limits in how much we can process. And that is one of the the other big question in the field that we would like to approach is, what defines those limits? At what point in the processing is the filtering happening? And what is the capacity of that system? So how much information can flow through, and how can you select one stream from another? And maybe, again, by selecting the right features, then you can perform very well in tasks that require paying attention to multiple streams, just because you identify the relevant information from each channel, and you're only, let's say, paying attention to those and ignoring kind of the background.
Right. And that seems to be exactly what's occurring. Like with when you mentioned the cocktail party, what I thought of was sort of like when, you're having a conversation with someone, and then, someone else from across the room says your name, right? And you're not paying attention to that, but then, you instantly are now paying attention. So it almost seems as though, like, the way I kind of think about that is, and I'm curious to hear if if you think about it the same way, is that, you know, that our brains, there may be sort of, we may not be really like consciously paying much attention to, you know, all of these other conversations, but there's some small kind of small amount of resources that are getting devoted to paying attention, and then those resources kind of increase if we hear something that's very relevant to us, like our name. Is that an accurate way to think about it, or not so much?
I think, let's see, I think similarly, but maybe from a slightly different perspective. The there is to, your proposal was maybe we're not applying all the resources to this one conversation, because when we get another signal, we're able to respond to it. So that makes sense to me. Like if we are completely immersed in this conversation, then maybe we will not hear even if they say our names. So it seems like the brain is keeping that balance between, sure, this is important, but I need to keep some resources open. Now, in attention, there are two types of attention. The one that is kind of volitional, the top down, the one that we're deciding what to pay attention to, and the one that comes from outside, the one that comes about things that are salient, like when someone says our name. And those processes, although related, they're a little different. So they're involving different things. So you could imagine that you could have your brain engage in some task, but there is something that could affect, something salient comes and says, hey, watch out, something else is happening, which seems like an advantage for behavior. Like we should be able to get to stop the process just being so focused if something important is happening outside. So yeah, in that sense, I agree with you. The way I like to think about it is that the brain is also, with this idea of making predictions, the brain really cares about surprises. So when someone says something like your name and you were not expecting it, it seems very important for the brain to learn from that. So maybe the salience in this stimuli comes from the idea that if someone says, if you're in the cocktail party having this conversation and someone says a name you don't know, your brain was expecting a ton of names, so that didn't matter. But someone says your name, maybe your brain wasn't expecting that. And that creates an error signal that says, hey, now you should pay attention to this because it's something you were not expecting, it happened, and it may help you learn how to, perform something in the future. So that's the way I look at this kind of how saliency takes our attention and kind of grabs our attention.
Yeah. It's interesting because people talk nowadays kind of just about wanting to be able to be so kind of like laser focused on one thing, but it seems like, as you're kind of talking about, like there might actually be reasons that our brain is sort of wired to be able to kind of switch attention and be able to, respond if we're working on sending emails and we hear a loud, bang at the door, like we're going to want to be able to respond to that.
Yes, I think it's very important. It kind of touches on another topic that we study in the lab, which is this idea of flexibility. And it goes beyond attention. It goes beyond just being able to shift from one conversation to another, but really from being in one state of, let's say, hyper focus to being in a state of more openness. And I think it's important, I can say just from the behavioral perspective, it's important to keep a good balance between the two. So some people have a deadline, they need to finish that one thing, they only have this amount of time. It seems like a good time to set your system into laser focus, finish up. But that's probably not going to be very good for creativity. So creativity may require more like an openness of let's let the information come in, try to relate it to other things that are coming in and things that we have from our past, and the internal models that our brain has to come up with something new. So I think is finding that balance, and there are some cognitive enhancing drugs that actually can set that balance in one extreme or the other. And maybe that, that's the way that people find that balance of, now you need to finish this thing. That's the way that they can focus on that. Or maybe now they need to be in a more open state.
What specific drugs are modifying either increasing that focus or increasing more of that open sort of space?
Yeah, so although I'm not an expert in the field, so I'm not gonna get into the details, but you can look for something like modafinil as a drug that people have used for getting this kind of intense focus on a task. And you could imagine that people who are experiencing something like LSD, then they provide a kind of a state of a different type of openness. But again, I don't think I'm the right person to ask the details about that.
Sure. I was just curious. So we're coming up onto the end of the show, but one of the last question I wanted to ask you is that kind of with all your research, does it change, when you are teaching classes? Does your knowledge of kind of how the brain processes auditory information, you're up there giving lectures, do you do specific things, or are there specific like methods of teaching that you employ on purpose to try to like help students retain the information better?
Yeah, so definitely. Although I'm not an expert on pedagogy and kind of learning in the classroom, then as a neuroscientist, the more you learn about how biological systems learn and how biological systems can pay attention to different things, the more you start seeing links to the behavior of both teachers and students in the classroom. And we value, in our teaching, we value a lot things like student-centered learning and interactions between students as they're learning different processes, and very active learning. So for example, the idea that someone just giving a lecture for an hour is not as effective as people actually trying to solve a problem together and learning from that. There may be a lot more content in the lecture, but what is retained for later stays much better, much longer if the person is actually involved in the process. So that's because the way some of the systems learn is, through this involvement of the motor process, and then whatever regions of our brain are creating, kind of producing these questions of what's going to happen next, and making the predictions and estimating the errors, that is changing the system in a more effective and long kind of lasting way, rather than just the passive process of just being exposed to something where our attention just wanders into different things. One interesting topic related to that, which we haven't explored much in our lab, but it would be interesting to check, is this idea that if there is, as you mentioned, a certain capacity of what we can process, then maybe if we're not feeling that whole capacity, then our brain kind of is allowed to wander and to just get distracted. So maybe the best way to engage in these kind of communications is making sure that the information content is rich enough that is keeping all our resources in that communication process, rather than allowing the process to just kind of like go elsewhere.
Interesting, right.
So you can imagine the people who need to be doing something as they listen to talks, or like drawing something, maybe they're filling up the rest of that capacity.
Right. That's an interesting way to think about it. Yeah. Well, awesome. Professor Jaramillo, if people were interested in the conversation we had today and wanted to find out more about your guys' work, where would you direct them to?
Yeah, so I'll give you basically 2 pointers. So one is you can find us on Twitter at Jaramillo Lab, and I imagine you will have a little link in the video for that. And then you can also search our lab at the University of Oregon website, and I can give you a link for that as well, if you can see kind of the details and the papers that we have published. And you can always reach me through email if you want to discuss some science, if you're interested in working in the lab as a high school student, an undergraduate student, a grad student, a postdoctoral fellow, or other type of researchers. We're always looking for motivated people and really bright people to work on these problems of auditory cognition.
Great. Awesome. And for those of you guys who did enjoy the show today, go ahead and like and subscribe to our YouTube channel. We're Roscoe's Wetsuit. And you can also find audio versions of the podcast available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, and we're now on Stitcher. And it seems like, with us talking about auditory cognition, it seems only right that people would listen to the audio version of this podcast, right?
That's right. We should have brought some examples, but I guess we'll do it next time.
Absolutely. All right. Well, Professor Jaramillo, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you very much. It's great having you.
Absolutely.